They say a mother's love is the ultimate shield, but nobody warns you when your own flesh and blood holds the blade. I believed Julian was my greatest pride, until the heat rising from my office floorboards revealed a life sentence with my name on it. Remember this survival rule for the 21st century: the most dangerous enemies do not break down your doors. They smile and walk in using the exact key you handed them. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to James' Revenge Stories. As you may know, YouTube has completely disabled monetization on our channel, leaving us without the necessary budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting our team with a donation of just $1 so our hardworking staff can pay for their living expenses and continue creating these thrilling tales for you. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description and pinned comment below. My name is Emery Peters. I am 46 years old, and I am the founder and chief executive officer of AuraCore Solutions, a highly successful technology conglomerate located in the sprawling, sun-baked hills of Austin, Texas. I built my entire empire from the ground up on the core principle of absolute, unbreakable control. My home, a magnificent smart mansion constructed of sleek glass and dark steel, was designed to be my ultimate sanctuary. It was supposed to be a fortress of predictability in a chaotic world. Every light fixture, every biometric lock, every ambient sound was meticulously calibrated to my exact personal preferences. I commanded my environment with the touch of a button. But perfection, I have painfully learned, is a very fragile illusion, and it only takes one single unnoticed hairline fracture to bring a towering structure crashing down around you. The ominous signs started small, creeping into my pristine reality like a slow-moving, invisible poison. First, it was the monthly utility statements. The electricity usage was suddenly skyrocketing, registering amounts that cost thousands of dollars, and made absolutely no logical sense for a single-family residential estate, even one as technologically advanced and power-hungry as mine. Following the billing spikes came the network anomalies. The internal wireless internet would inexplicably drop completely dead at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning every single night, running on a schedule as precise as a Swiss watch. Yet the most deeply unsettling irregularity was strictly confined to my private working study. It was a spacious, minimalist room, anchored by wide, expensive planks of imported white oak. Over the past few weeks, a strange, localized climate had aggressively developed within those 4 walls. The temperature in my study was always several degrees warmer than the rest of the massive house. The suffocating ambient heat seemed to radiate directly from one specific corner where the white oak floorboards emitted a faint, near imperceptible humming sound. It was a microscopic vibration, a low synthetic purr that physically resonated through the soles of my shoes whenever I stood too close to that side of the desk. When I brought the issue up, my son Julian was incredibly quick to dismiss my growing concerns. Julian is 26 years old, a brilliant, sharp-minded young network engineer with a bright smile that could instantly disarm the most hostile corporate boardroom. To the outside world, he was the absolute picture of filial devotion and respect. Every morning, without fail, he would brew a cup of ridiculously expensive artisan coffee and carry it into my study, setting it gently beside my keyboard. "It is just a minor glitch in the subfloor radiant heating, Mom," he would say, flashing that perfect, easygoing grin that I loved so much. "The thermostat is simply misreading the ambient room temperature and overcompensating. I will have my usual maintenance guys come out and recalibrate the thermal sensors this weekend. Do not worry your head about it. I have got it handled." I desperately wanted to believe him. A mother always wants to believe the best about her child. But maternal instinct is a primitive, feral thing, and deep in my gut, an alarm was screaming. I slowly began to notice the micro-expressions, the tiny, fleeting slips in his carefully curated mask. Whenever he handed me that steaming mug of morning coffee, his dark eyes would instinctively dart toward that warm, humming corner of the floor, before finally locking onto my face. It was a fraction of a second, an involuntary nervous twitch of anxiety, but once I finally noticed it, I could not unsee it. He was not looking at the wood itself. He was checking on something hiding beneath the floorboards. The undeniable breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, while Julian was across town attending a networking event. I was sitting at my desk reviewing contracts when a loud, sharp crack violently echoed through the silent study. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the corner of the room, the heat had clearly reached a critical, dangerous threshold. The pristine white oak planks were actively warping, curling upward, and groaning under immense, unnatural thermal stress. The air in the room suddenly tasted metallic and unnervingly dry, like the atmosphere right before a lightning strike. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. This was definitely not a faulty heating pipe. I immediately bypassed the estate management company, and I certainly did not call the friendly maintenance team Julian always recommended. Instead, I reached out to a private, independent smart systems integration specialist named Vance, a man known in the highest tech circles for his brutal honesty and uncompromising discretion. When Vance arrived 20 minutes later, he did not look like a regular handyman. He carried no leather tool belt, no hammers, no crowbars. He walked through my front door, holding only a heavy, matte black, military-grade electromagnetic spectrum scanner. He did not bother with polite introductions or pleasantries. He strode directly into my study, took one long look at the buckled wood, and then stared down at the glowing screen of his scanning device. The digital readings on the monitor spiked violently, flashing red warnings. "Turn off your cellular phone," Vance ordered, his voice completely devoid of any customer service warmth. "Right now, and go yank the power cord out of the main house router. Do not log into the digital system to shut it down. Physically pull the plug out of the wall." I did exactly as he instructed, my hands trembling uncontrollably as the entire mansion plunged into a sudden, disconnected offline silence. The unnatural quiet was heavy and deafening. I returned to the study to find Vance kneeling on the floor. He used a specialized titanium pry bar to carefully lift the ruined, warped oak plank away from the joists. A thick wave of intense, blistering heat rolled out from the exposed, dark cavity. Vance did not reach his hands inside. He simply stared down into the darkness, the red glow from within illuminating his hardened features. Slowly, he raised his head and looked up at me. It was a look I will never forget for as long as I live. It was the grim, haunted, terrifying expression of a bomb squad technician who had just realized the digital timer had already hit 0. I peered down into the gaping dark void beneath the shattered floorboards, expecting to see a ruptured copper water line or a severely malfunctioning radiant heating coil. There was no plumbing. There was no heating equipment. Instead, securely bolted to the raw concrete subfloor, sat a meticulously engineered miniature dark web server cluster. It was a terrifying masterpiece of clandestine hardware architecture crammed into a space barely wider than a standard shipping box. Thick, translucent, synthetic tubes coiled tightly like mechanical serpents around stacks of matte black solid-state hard drives. These tubes were vigorously pumping a heavy, viscous liquid cooling agent to keep the densely packed processors from literally melting through the foundation. The setup was running completely parallel to the main electrical grid of the estate. Whoever built this had bypassed the standard power lines and created a ghost circuit directly tapping into the main underground municipal supply line to completely mask its massive continuous energy consumption from the standard residential utility meters. Vance moved with the clinical, merciless precision of a seasoned forensic investigator tearing apart an active crime scene. As a former military cybersecurity contractor, he was a man who spoke the native language of complex algorithms and hostile firewall breaches. He reached deep into the heated cavity with a pair of rubber-insulated forceps, carefully shifting the cooling tubes aside. He pulled up a thick, shielded bundle of fiber optic cables, tracing their origin with a tightly clenched jaw. These cables were not merely tapping into my basic home wireless network. They were physically spliced with surgical accuracy directly into the encrypted corporate backbone of AuraCore Solutions. Someone had established an undetectable physical bridge straight from my home into my company's central executive mainframe. Worse still, they had effortlessly bypassed the impenetrable external security protocols by routing the entire connection through my own personal highest-tier super administrator credentials. Deep within the recessed cavity, hundreds of tiny red light-emitting diodes blinked furiously in the shadows. They pulsed rapidly, rhythmically, like a malicious digital heartbeat. The system was clearly running at absolute maximum capacity. Vance attached a small, heavily shielded diagnostic tablet to one of the main input-output ports on the primary server rack. He bypassed the initial lock screen in seconds, and lines of raw, uncompiled data began to scroll violently across his monitor. The server was not simply hoarding random information. It was actively encrypting, compressing, and warehousing thousands upon thousands of gigabytes of highly classified intelligence. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat as I read the decrypted file directory headers flashing past. There were stolen military defense blueprints, classified aerospace engineering schematics, and illicit financial ledgers belonging to several major government defense contractors. The sheer, overwhelming volume of stolen federal data resting silently beneath my feet was staggering enough to guarantee a lifetime behind bars in a maximum security federal penitentiary. A wave of profound, debilitating nausea washed over me, forcing me to grip the edge of my desk for balance. I stared blankly at the custom serial numbers stamped onto the cooling reservoirs and the titanium server racks. My mind raced backwards, frantically cross-referencing those numbers with the recent anomalous charges on my private banking statements that I had carelessly authorized without a second thought. The horrific realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Every single piece of this illicit military-grade hardware had been legally purchased under my exact name. It was all paid for using my personal highest-tier black credit cards. The shipping manifests would all point directly to this exact residential address. Vance ran a rapid tracer route on the localized network node and confirmed my absolute worst fear. The sole Internet Protocol address pointing outward from this massive digital hoarding operation was geolocated flawlessly to this exact room, my private executive study. If any federal agency looked at the paper trail, I was the undisputed sole architect of this massive treasonous enterprise. "This is not a permanent storage facility," Vance muttered, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that chilled the suffocating air in the room. His fingers flew across his tablet screen as he aggressively cracked into the foundational source code of the server system. "This is a highly automated delivery mechanism." He tapped the glass, highlighting a heavily obfuscated string of executing commands. It was a digital countdown timer ticking down relentlessly in the background. In exactly 14 days, at precisely midnight, the localized encryption surrounding all these stolen files would be programmed to intentionally fail. All the internal firewalls would automatically collapse, and the entire payload of espionage data and money laundering transaction histories would be packaged and broadcasted directly into the external threat monitoring servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was a perfectly laid trap designed to look like a catastrophic mistake made by an arrogant, careless criminal mastermind. Suddenly, the tense silence was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic vibration against my left wrist. While my main phone was completely disconnected, I had forgotten to power down the independent cellular connection on my smartwatch. A new text message brightly illuminated the small sapphire glass face. It was from Julian. "Mom, has the floor guy arrived yet? I changed the schedule today to get a much better, highly rated specialist out there for you. Please do not let any strangers into your office." The sweet, deeply caring tone of his message felt like a rusted blade twisting violently in my stomach. The suffocating weight of the betrayal was paralyzing, freezing the blood in my veins. I slowly looked up from the glowing watch face, only to see Vance pointing a solitary gloved finger at the bottom right corner of his diagnostic screen. He had successfully isolated the primary creator identification tag for the entire malware structure. There, glowing in stark, unforgiving white text against the black terminal background, was a uniquely structured cryptographic signature. It was an elegant, incredibly complex custom algorithmic loop that I recognized instantly, a piece of code that felt as familiar to me as my own reflection. It was the exact same digital signature I had so proudly and lovingly taught my only son to write when he was a boy just 12 years old. We could not simply rip the illicit server out of the floor. Doing so would sever the connection immediately, triggering whatever fail-safes my son had undoubtedly coded into the system, alerting him that his trap had been discovered. Instead, Vance and I meticulously returned the warped white oak plank to its exact original position, leaving the glowing, humming nightmare exactly where it was. We then relocated our entire diagnostic operation down into the subterranean concrete bunker I utilized as an emergency storm shelter and isolated security hub. Down there, shielded by several feet of reinforced concrete and lead lining, Vance established a passive, untraceable ghost connection to the primary drive of the hidden server. He began siphoning the encrypted data drop by agonizing drop, mirroring the architecture without tripping a single one of Julian's intricate intrusion alarms. I sat in the dim, sterile fluorescent light of the underground bunker, watching lines of stolen data slowly translate into readable files across the massive monitors. The initial paralyzing shock of the discovery had passed, leaving behind a clinical forensic need to dissect the architecture of my own execution. It took Vance almost 3 hours of relentless keyboard strikes to bypass the secondary encryption layer surrounding a hidden, heavily fortified partition on the cloned hard drive. What spilled out onto the screens was not stolen government intelligence or classified military schematics, but a horrifying, irrefutable ledger of personal ruin. It was a meticulously detailed accounting of Julian's secret parallel life. My brilliant, charming boy was drowning in a suffocating ocean of underground syndicate gambling debts. I scrolled silently through page after endless page of off-the-books international sports betting high-stakes illegal offshore poker rings and wildly leveraged cryptocurrency margins that had violently crashed. The final tally was not a minor, youthful indiscretion. The debt was staggering. He was in the hole for over $40 million owed to ruthless cartels and shadow syndicates who did not send polite collection notices. Intercepted encrypted messages buried deep within the communication files revealed explicit graphic death threats. They were promising to break his legs to hunt him down, and to dissect him piece by piece if the massive debt was not settled in full by the end of the current fiscal quarter. But why target me? Why not simply come to me and ask for the money? The devastating answer lay in a legally binding digital document sitting cleanly in a locked folder labeled with my personal initials. It was a complete notarized copy of my personal estate trust fund. The fund held liquid assets, international real estate, and majority voting shares totaling over $500 million. Julian knew I would never liquidate my life's work to pay off a violent criminal syndicate. I had built AuraCore Solutions with my own blood sweat and ruthless determination. I would have forced him to face the brutal consequences of his own reckless actions rather than fund organized crime. He knew that absolute truth about my character. So he had scoured the dense legal paperwork until he found the fatal flaw. It was a highly specific morality and incapacitation clause I had instructed my corporate lawyers to draft over a decade ago. The clause clearly and legally stipulated that in the event I was convicted of a federal felony and sentenced to a federal penitentiary for a term exceeding 10 years, my fiduciary authority would be permanently and irrevocably revoked. Full unencumbered control of the entire $500 million estate would automatically and immediately transfer to my sole legal heir, Julian. The sheer calculated elegance of his plan was breathtaking in its absolute cruelty. A traditional assassination would be sloppy and chaotic. If he hired a professional to kill me, or if I suffered a sudden, tragic, and fatal accident, the local homicide detectives and federal insurance investigators would immediately look at the primary financial beneficiary. The scrutiny would be endless. The assets would be completely frozen for years in probate court, and his violent creditors would absolutely not wait that long for their money. But framing me, framing his own mother as an international cyber-terrorism mastermind, that was a stroke of pure, unadulterated evil genius. By utilizing the federal government of the United States as his personal hitman, he guaranteed my permanent removal without spilling a single drop of physical blood. The authorities would seize my home, arrest me in front of the press, and lock me away in a maximum security cell. Once the judge's gavel dropped, the trust would legally trigger. The syndicate would get their tens of millions of dollars, and Julian would inherit the vast corporate empire I had built, walking away clean as the tragic, grieving son of a disgraced corporate traitor. Then Vance opened a hidden audio directory. "You need to brace yourself for this," Vance warned, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of emotion. He tapped the spacebar on his keyboard. A voice filled the cold concrete bunker. It was my voice. It carried my exact cadence, my slight southern drawl, the precise authoritative tone I always used during hostile board meetings. "Transfer the remaining encrypted files to the offshore server by midnight," my stolen voice commanded from the speakers. "If the federal agents get close to the estate, wipe the drives completely. I will not tolerate any mistakes." I stared at the audio monitors in absolute sickening horror. I had never spoken those words in my entire life. Vance pulled up the graphical user interface of the software running the audio files. It was an advanced military-grade deepfake voice cloning application. Interspersed with the fabricated recordings were the practice sessions. I heard Julian breathing, clearing his throat, casually adjusting the pitch and modulation sliders, actively directing the artificial intelligence to mimic his mother's vocal cords perfectly. He was using these synthesized recordings to leave incriminating voicemails for known underground data brokers. Aggressively cementing the fabricated evidence trail against me, I listened to my own stolen voice echo against the impenetrable walls of the bunker. I pictured Julian sitting comfortably in his spacious bedroom just down the hall, casually sipping the artisan coffee he bought with my money, cheerfully synthesizing the audio that would end my life. In that exact moment, the agonizing, suffocating grief that had gripped my chest since I saw his digital signature under the floorboards simply evaporated. The mother who had lovingly packed his school lunches, the mother who had proudly celebrated his college graduation, the mother who had blindly trusted his easygoing smile. She died right there in that subterranean room. She was entirely burned away, reduced to ash. In her place, something else took root. It was a profound, absolute zero coldness. It was a bone-chilling crystalline rage, pure and completely unadulterated by any lingering maternal affection. My son did not just want to steal my wealth. He was actively, meticulously orchestrating the complete and total annihilation of my freedom, my hard-earned reputation, and my very existence. He wanted me rotting in a concrete box until the day I died, all so he could pay off a poker debt. Ascending the stairs from the concrete bunker back into the immaculate, brightly lit halls of my home was the most difficult acting performance of my entire life. I had to seamlessly slip back into the skin of the oblivious, loving mother, a role I had played genuinely and without reservation for 26 years. That evening, when Julian walked through the massive front doors, cheerfully carrying a large bouquet of fresh blue hydrangeas and humming a popular radio tune, I met him in the grand foyer. I forced myself to smile. I actually smiled, utilizing every ounce of my corporate negotiation training to allow the artificial warmth to reach my eyes. I embraced the young man who had coldly priced my freedom and my future at $40 million. I thanked him profusely for his thoughtfulness regarding the floor repairmen, praising how wonderfully he always took care of his aging mother. The absolute ease with which the lethal lies flowed from his smiling mouth was matched only by the terrifying smoothness of my own counter-deception. We sat across from each other at the long mahogany dining table, sharing a ridiculously expensive bottle of imported French red wine, laughing together at his charming anecdotes about his day. Every single time he affectionately called me Mom, I took a slow, measured sip of the dark wine to wash down the rising metallic taste of absolute disgust and betrayal. While Julian slept soundly in his luxurious wing of the estate, fully believing his trap was flawlessly executing in the darkness beneath us, Vance and I initiated our silent, devastating counter-offensive. We absolutely did not touch the physical servers hidden beneath the white oak floorboards. Instead, operating from the subterranean bunker, Vance engineered a microscopic, highly aggressive phantom firewall, wrapping it completely around the external digital shell of Julian's dark web cluster. It was a brilliant digital parasite. Every single time Julian's automated system reached out into the ether to plant more fabricated evidence, or to synthesize another damning deepfake audio file using my stolen voice, our invisible net caught the data packets. It cloned them instantly. and then silently fed the original packets back into his machine so his system would never register a disruption. We were quietly siphoning his poison right out of the digital air. I sat for hours watching the cascading streams of code on Vance's glowing monitors meticulously mapping the entire architecture of my son's treason. We were not merely building a defensive perimeter, we were meticulously constructing a mirrored labyrinth. We collected every keystroke, every secure login credential, and every digital fingerprint of his malicious intent, perfectly preserving his guilt for the impending counterstrike. The psychological warfare escalated drastically 2 days later when Julian casually announced we were having a highly esteemed guest for dinner. He introduced a slick, sharply dressed, fast-talking man named Marcus, claiming the man was a senior security consultant from a highly respected firm called Vanguard Cybernetics. I recognized the corporate name immediately from my years in the industry. It was a known shell corporation, a hollow ghost entity frequently utilized by shadow data brokers and corporate mercenaries. Julian's strategy was transparent and chillingly effective. He desperately needed a credible external eyewitness. His plan was to subtly maneuver this associate into my private study under the guise of an impromptu architectural tour of the estate, timing it perfectly to accidentally catch me sitting at my executive desk while the encrypted server monitors were fully visible. This would solidify the federal narrative that I was the undeniable mastermind of the operation caught red-handed by an independent security expert. I played the role of the gracious, hospitable corporate executive flawlessly. I poured the expensive drinks, engaged in meaningless, polite corporate banter, and waited patiently for the perfect tactical opening. It presented itself during the main course, as Marcus enthusiastically gestured with his hands while explaining a completely fabricated software deployment strategy. I smoothly reached across the wide table, pretending to reach for the silver salt shaker. With calculated, deliberate clumsiness, my wrist heavily clipped the base of his overflowing crystal goblet. The heavy dark red wine splashed violently across the immaculate white silk of his expensive tailored dress shirt. "Oh my goodness, I am so incredibly sorry," I gasped, leaping up from my dining chair and frantically grabbing a linen napkin to dab at the mess. I forcefully ushered a cursing, highly flustered Marcus into the adjacent marble powder room to clean up, firmly insisting he take off the ruined shirt so my housekeeper could immediately treat the stain before it set permanently. The exact moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut and locked behind him, the real operation began. Marcus had foolishly left his tailored suit jacket draped over the back of his dining chair, his highly encrypted mobile device resting heavily in the inner breast pocket. Vance, perfectly disguised in the dark tailored uniform of my private catering staff, stepped silently from the shadows of the butler's pantry. He had exactly 45 seconds before Marcus would realize his phone was exposed. The tension in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. Vance smoothly extracted the device, swiftly pressing a specialized biometric decryption pad against its back casing. The green progress bar on Vance's wrist monitor crawled agonizingly slowly. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Julian was standing in the kitchen completely oblivious, aggressively demanding the private chef find a bottle of club soda for the stain. 30 seconds. The digital lock clicked open. Vance rapidly cloned the entire hidden directory, securing the undeniable encrypted transaction logs between Marcus and my son, detailing the exact monetary price of his false testimony. 40 seconds. Vance slipped the phone perfectly back into the silken pocket without leaving a single crease, vanishing into the darkened hallway, just as the powder room door swung open. With the irrefutable evidence firmly in our grasp, I began the final crucial phase of my financial retaliation. Over the next 36 hours, I utilized my deepest, most secure corporate back channels to systematically drain millions of dollars from my highly liquid short-term investment portfolios. I rapidly converted massive sums of cash into completely untraceable physical assets, routing the wealth through complex blind trusts located in overseas jurisdictions that absolutely did not honor federal subpoenas. However, to ensure Julian suspected absolutely nothing, I employed a highly complex series of algorithmic ghost ledgers. If he or his violent cartel contacts checked the primary trust fund balances on paper, the $500 million still appeared completely untouched, a glittering fatal illusion sitting safely in the bank. The digital timer buried beneath my study floorboards now read exactly 48 hours until the automatic federal broadcast. The atmosphere inside the massive mansion grew unbearably heavy, thick with unspoken anticipation and lethal secrets. Julian's behavior became increasingly erratic and suffocatingly affectionate. He lingered around me, constantly flashing his brilliant smile and constantly offering to help with mundane household tasks. That evening, as I stood by the massive glass bay windows looking out over the darkened, sprawling estate, he approached me from behind and wrapped his arms tightly around my shoulders in a firm, possessive embrace. "You have built such an incredible empire, Mom," he whispered softly into my ear, gently resting his chin on my shoulder. "Do not worry about a thing. I will always protect your legacy." I placed my hand over his, squeezing his fingers affectionately. "I know you will, Julian," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, staring coldly at our reflection in the dark glass. "I know exactly what you are capable of doing." The digital countdown timer buried beneath the white oak floorboards read exactly 12 hours until the automatic federal broadcast. The massive estate was completely silent, draped in the heavy shadows of the early morning hours. I stood in the center of my study, staring down at the raw, glowing circuitry of the server cluster. The paralyzing fear and the suffocating grief that had plagued me for the past 2 weeks were entirely gone. They had been completely incinerated, replaced by a boiling, hyper-focused clarity. I was no longer a heartbroken mother desperately hiding from a devastating truth. I was the architect of an inescapable punishment. I was a chief executive officer ruthlessly neutralizing a catastrophic internal threat. I knelt on the hard concrete subfloor, carefully pushing aside the thick liquid cooling tubes. I was not there to smash the hard drives or physically sever the fiber optic connection. Destroying the hardware would only delay the inevitable and alert Julian that his plot had failed. Instead, I was there to rewrite the core protocol of his entire treasonous enterprise. Through a highly encrypted, invisible earpiece, Vance's calm, steady voice guided my shaking hands. I held a high-temperature soldering iron, the heated metal tip glowing a fierce, bright orange in the dim light. "Steady your wrist," Vance instructed quietly into my ear. "You need to attach the microchip directly onto the primary data bus on the central motherboard. It has to be a flawless connection." The biometric relay chip Vance had custom-engineered was smaller than a standard fingernail, yet it held the power to completely reverse the flow of an international cyber investigation. Taking a deep, measured breath, I pressed the iron down, melting a tiny bead of silver solder and seamlessly fusing the chip into the beating heart of Julian's machine. Once the hardware was secured, I carefully routed a hair-thin wire from the server directly into the wall panel containing the biometric security scanner for the study door. The trap was meticulously set. The server was no longer tied to an automated countdown timer. It was now directly linked to the unique physiological markers of my son. It was programmed to wait for his specific fingerprint and his exact retinal pattern. When the sun finally rose, pouring bright golden light across the Texas hills, I emerged from my bedroom dressed in a sharp, intimidating corporate suit, briskly pulling a small leather travel suitcase behind me. Julian was already in the kitchen, casually sipping his artisan coffee. I walked in projecting an aura of intense, highly stressed corporate annoyance. "I have a catastrophic supply chain emergency in Chicago," I announced, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. "I have to fly out on the corporate jet immediately. I will likely be gone for at least 3 days." I watched closely as a sudden, barely concealed flash of absolute triumph illuminated Julian's dark eyes. It was the look of a predator watching the trapdoor finally swing shut. He quickly masked his glee with a perfectly rehearsed expression of filial concern. "Oh no, Mom, that sounds incredibly stressful," Julian said smoothly, stepping forward to give me a tight, reassuring hug. "Do you want me to drive you to the private airfield? Do not worry about the house. I will keep a close eye on everything while you are away." "The corporate driver is already waiting at the front gate," I replied, pulling away from his embrace just a fraction of a second early. "Just make sure you lock up properly tonight, Julian." I walked out the heavy front doors, stepping into the waiting black vehicle. I deliberately created the perfect uninterrupted vacuum. Julian truly believed I was thousands of miles away, entirely isolated in a boardroom, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine swinging down toward my neck. Through the hidden microscopic security cameras Vance had aggressively planted throughout the estate, we watched the final act unfold from our secure off-site monitoring location. Barely 20 minutes after my car pulled away from the gates, Julian stopped pretending. His relaxed, easygoing posture vanished, replaced by a rigid, arrogant swagger. He walked directly down the hall and confidently entered my private study. He stood over the area where the hidden server lay, pulling his heavily encrypted mobile phone from his pocket. He did not want to wait for the midnight automated trigger. With his primary target out of the state, he decided to manually execute the final phase. He opened his custom application, smiled a cold, victorious smile, and pressed the command labeled Activate. He believed he had just opened the data floodgates, anonymously broadcasting my fabricated guilt to the highest levels of the federal government. Tucking the phone back into his pocket, he turned around and walked toward the exit of the study. He reached out and pressed his right thumb firmly against the glowing glass of the biometric door scanner to unlock the panel. That single arrogant fingerprint was the ignition key. The microsecond his biological data registered on the scanner, the microscopic chip I had soldered into the motherboard woke up and aggressively hijacked the core protocol. The digital trap violently inverted. Within a fraction of a second, the highly sophisticated malware wiped my name, my financial records, and my administrative credentials from the outgoing broadcast. The fabricated deepfake audio files were instantly overwritten with the raw, unedited recordings of Julian practicing the impersonation. The fake international protocol addresses were aggressively rerouted, pointing firmly and undeniably to his personal laptop, his private cellular device, and his hidden offshore gambling accounts. The system was no longer framing me. It was screaming Julian's undeniable, irrefutable guilt directly into the primary threat monitoring servers of the Department of Justice. Completely oblivious to the catastrophic digital avalanche he had just triggered against himself, Julian strolled casually into the expansive, sunlit living room. He walked over to the crystal bar cart, grabbed an expensive imported bottle of vintage champagne, and smoothly popped the cork. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into a tall crystal flute, raising it in a silent, mocking toast to the empty room. He took a long, satisfying sip, completely unaware of the heavy mechanical roar of federal armored tactical vehicles rapidly tearing down the private access road. The piercing, deafening wail of emergency sirens began to echo violently across the manicured lawns, swiftly tightening an inescapable steel perimeter around the brilliant, arrogant boy who had just successfully engineered his own absolute destruction. The heavy reinforced mahogany front doors of my estate did not simply swing open. They violently splintered inward off their steel hinges with a deafening concussive crash. A synchronized, overwhelming wave of heavily armed tactical agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation flooded into the expansive living room. Their tactical rifles were raised laser sights, cutting sharply through the airborne dust illuminated by the morning sun. They did not even glance in my direction. Julian barely had time to register the shattered crystal of his dropped champagne flute before 3 heavily armored operatives viciously tackled him. They drove his face brutally into the cold, polished marble floor. "Mom!" Julian shrieked, his voice cracking in absolute panicked terror as thick zip ties aggressively bit into his wrists, pinning his arms behind his back. "Mom, call the lawyers! Help me!" I did not run toward him. I stepped slowly out from the cool, shadowed alcove of the grand spiral staircase, my high heels clicking rhythmically against the stone. I stood over him, my expression perfectly smooth, completely empty of the frantic maternal panic he so desperately expected to see. I simply looked down at the boy I had raised, watching him helplessly writhe against the heavy combat boots of the federal agents. From the hallway leading to my study, the loud, violent sounds of splintering wood echoed sharply. The Federal Cyber Division had marched straight into my private sanctuary. They aggressively tore up the entire section of warped white oak floorboards, ripping the miniature dark web server cluster directly from its concrete grave. The lead technical director walked into the living room, holding up a sealed anti-static evidence bag containing the primary liquid-cooled drives. He loudly confirmed to the commanding officer that the preliminary rapid scans matched the anonymous intelligence drop they had received exactly 1 hour prior. There was absolutely no trace of my administrative credentials anywhere in the code. The system was entirely saturated with Julian's unique biometric data, his sweat DNA pulled from the physical hardware, his fingerprints, and his personal cryptographic developer signatures. The heavy steel doors of a second armored vehicle swung open outside, and 2 agents dragged a highly familiar, visibly trembling figure through my ruined entryway. It was Marcus, the slick corporate associate from Vanguard Cybernetics. His expensive suit was terribly wrinkled and heavily stained with sweat. He took one terrified look at the federal agents swarming the house and began shouting his full confession loudly, repeating everything he had already told the authorities during his panicked interrogation. He completely surrendered the entire extortion conspiracy on the spot, detailing exactly how Julian had promised him millions of dollars to provide fabricated testimony against me. Julian stopped struggling. The horrific reality of his complete and utter defeat finally washed over his bruised face. He looked frantically from Marcus to the extracted servers and finally to me. Then, a new, much deeper agony twisted his features as the final piece of my absolute retaliation clicked into place in his mind. He screamed in pure, unadulterated despair, suddenly remembering the mirrored trap hidden within the $500 million trust fund paperwork. The morality clause he had tried to use as a lethal weapon against me possessed a devastating reciprocal condition. If the sole designated heir was ever indicted for federal treason or organized cyber terrorism against the government, their name would be instantly and permanently eradicated from the family lineage. The legal mechanisms would completely vaporize his inheritance. The violent criminal syndicates he owed $40 million would instantly realize they were never getting a single penny, and the federal prison walls would be his only protection from them. The commanding officer hauled Julian roughly to his feet, propelling him toward the shattered front entrance. As he was shoved past me, his arrogant facade completely shattered. He broke down into ugly, pathetic sobs. "Mom, please!" he wept, tears streaming down his face. "I am sorry. Please do not let them do this. I am your son." I stepped directly into his path, forcing the heavily armed escorting agents to pause for a brief second. I reached out with steady hands and gently, meticulously adjusted the wrinkled collar of his expensive designer shirt. I leaned in close, my lips brushing against his ear, and whispered with absolute freezing finality, "The floor is fixed, Julian. There is just enough room down there to bury our motherly love." I stepped back and turned my face away. The operatives dragged him out into the glaring Texas sunlight. The last sound to echo across my silent, empty estate was the heavy metallic slam of the federal prison transport doors locking shut forever. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for tuning in to James' Revenge Stories today. We would absolutely love to know where you are listening from, so please take a moment to let us know your location in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and satisfying, we humbly ask that you consider helping our channel with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by utilizing the PayPal link located in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support is the only way we can pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating these incredible stories for you. Thank you again, and stay safe.